Kia ora koutou and welcome everyone to our webinar on the Draft Dog Control Bylaw and Policy. I'm Crystal Anderson, an Engagement Advisor here at Council and your host for this webinar. Thanks to everyone for joining us online. We're going to start by giving you an overview of the main proposed changes, and we'll talk through some of the government legislation and what that requires us to do, and we'll chat through some of the reasons behind the proposed changes to the Dog Control Bylaw and Policy. We'll have some time for questions at the end of the session, so make sure you pop these in the chat as you think of them. First, I'll introduce you to the team behind the screen and tell you how you can participate during this session. I'll then hand over to our presenters who will run you through this session. This afternoon, you'll be hearing from Tina from our policy team and from Lionel from our animal management team. We also have Olivia working hard behind the scenes to keep the session running smoothly. If you're hard of hearing or you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just click the three small dots above the More at the top of your Teams screen and click Turn on Live Captions near the bottom of the drop-down list. Your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving, but you can ask questions in the Microsoft Teams chat, which is located in the top bar menu as a speech bubble. If you're not able to use this feature, you can email your questions through to letstalk.ccc.govt.nz. We'll try to answer as many of the questions as we can during the session, but all questions will be answered in our Q&A document that'll be emailed out to you within the next few days. One last thing from me, hopefully the banner came up to let you know that this session is being recorded. The recording will be shared on our YouTube channel and our Let's Talk page in the next few days. I'll now hand over to Tina to start our presentation.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, run through things. There's a lot of information to cover, so I'll go quite quickly and hopefully that will leave us plenty of time for questions at the end if we haven't already answered them. So every council has to have a policy on dogs and a bylaw to enforce it. The Dog Control Act is what requires us to have a policy, and that covers national rules as well for all dogs in New Zealand, and it also provides us with enforcement tools through the bylaw. So it lets us regulate local areas and respond to local issues, which is great. We have to do a review at least once every 10 years. It's quite an involved process. We have to more or less start from scratch with it and look at everything that we're doing. We did our last review in 2015 and adopted the bylaw and policy in 2016, and a lot has changed in that time. Each time we do a review, we have to check in with our community and undertake consultation and hearings, which is really great to understand what everyone is thinking about where we're at with things. So some of the things that have changed in the last almost 10 years, we've had a lot of land use and water management change in the Christchurch area, and particularly post-quake land changes. So in some areas we've got a higher water table and lower land, and around some of our estuaries and waterways we've got more salt marsh in different areas, so we're looking at changes in those places. We also have some stormwater basins that we didn't have before. So as part of our post-quake management of stormwater and flooding in Christchurch, we have new basins and new wetlands, some engineered ones, and some of those areas have got great recreation trails and things in them. We also have the former red zone areas, so that's the Otakaro Avon River corridor and also Brooklands to the north of the city. And when we last did the policy and bylaw, those areas weren't in council control or open to the public, so we are looking at putting regulations in those new areas that we have. We've also got new subdivisions and development around the city, and that changes what we're doing. That gives us new drainage and recreation reserves. And we also have an increased focus on restoring habitats and encouraging biodiversity. We've got amazing plantings happening around our city and on the peninsula, and that's changing what we're doing and how we might manage dogs in those areas. Our public spaces are changing as well. We've got an increase in shared paths. We had some before, but there's definitely a change there to have more wheeled devices in a lot of our public spaces. So there's an increase. You'll see kids on balance bikes. We've got scooters. We've got e-bikes. All of those things have changed quite a lot in the last 10 years. We've also got new housing and settlement around the place, which changes the volume of use that we have in our parks and where dogs are being taken. And we also have more people and more dogs than before. So since we last did the review, we've got over 5,000 more dogs in the district, so we're up to nearly 45,000 dogs now, and that might change the way that the community views dog control and the activities that are happening around the place. So community views evolve, and this is a great way for us to check in with what people's thoughts are about dogs in public places. So we're guided by legislation when we're making this policy and bylaw. So this is really important. This is what we're required to focus on, that all councils are with developing a dog control policy. So we need to look to minimise the danger, distress and nuisance that may be caused by dogs. And that's quite broad. It's not just about dog attacks and injuries, but it's about how people feel in those public spaces, about dogs running up to people, about people not picking up after their dogs, chasing wildlife, those sorts of things. We need to look to minimise uncontrolled access to public places from dogs, and particularly spaces where children are. So that's a particular requirement in the Act. So we need to have dogs that are well controlled in our public spaces. We also need to ensure that people can access public spaces and amenities without fear of attack or intimidation. So it really is about how people feel in those public spaces. And we also need to look to provide opportunities for people to provide for recreational opportunities for dogs and their owners. So they are the 4 things that we're guided by in legislation when doing this policy. So it's much wider than just attacks and injuries. I know that we've had some questions through from people asking us, well, you know, what's happening with attacks and injuries, but it's also about those wider things that are happening. And in terms of the numbers and statistics and data, we know that we hold a lot of data, but we don't know, that data doesn't tell the whole story. There's a lot of unreported incidents that occur. People might talk to their friends and family or take to social media to talk about what's happened rather than making a formal report to the council. So we're trying to pay attention to a lot of different things and looking at how we can make our public spaces better. People have also asked about tickets that have been issued and non-compliance and what's happening with enforcement around the district. We do try to work on an educational basis. We're really wanting people to do the right thing rather than punishing people. So the numbers of our tickets may not reflect what's happening around the place, but that's because the aim is to have well-controlled dogs in public spaces. So this work that we're doing is about how people feel. It's about what the community sense of access that dogs should have, and it's about what the norms and expectations are in our public places. So this impacts on dog owners, and it also impacts on everyone that uses public spaces. So we're interested in everyone's views on these matters. So this is a really important point to make, and I think in some areas there's quite wide misunderstanding about this. So the default in our district is that dogs are allowed off leash and under effective control by default. Now that's different to what some councils have. In some councils, dogs need to be leashed in all public places. So we're actually quite dog friendly in our district, despite some of the rules that we do have in place, but they're in place for good reason. So the places where the default of off leash and under effective control doesn't apply are in the general leashed areas. So that's a general rule. It's something that applies to every situation. So on all roads, in all cemeteries and in all boat ramps, you have to have your dog leashed. We also have general prohibited areas. So that will be all playgrounds, children's paddling pools, and in skate parks. And then we have specific requirements. So this map that you can see there, that's from our website, and that lists all of the specific areas, and that's a reflection of what's in the policy. So if you want to look at the details on areas and what the regulation is, then you can either click on these areas in the map, or you can look in the schedule to the policy. So those are our specified areas, so they will be a named area. So in this particular park or reserve, this is what the rules are there, and the reasons for those rules are also set out in the policy, or if you click on any of those shapes. So that's that. We are looking at protecting wildlife in this review. That has been a focus. We've been working really closely with our parks team and with land managers, ecologists and ornithologists to look at what we should be doing in some of our public spaces, particularly as they're changing. We have a focus on coastal wetlands and estuaries, so that's mudflats, salt meadows, salt marsh, estuary environments around Brooklands, the estuary in Christchurch, and around areas in Banks Peninsula as well. We're looking at inland wetlands and waterways, so that's those drainage basins and new wetlands and existing wetlands and waterways, naturalised waterways. We're really lucky in our district to have the ways that we have of managing water and all the naturalisation that occurs. We also are looking at coastal and river environments. So, for example, rocky shorelines have some protections that are needed, and same with gravel areas. So some of these birds that you can see on the screen here nest in very strange places. So you'll see there at the top in the middle, there's a little scratch of sand with some eggs in it. So a lot of these birds that we're looking to protect are threatened or at-risk birds, and they're of national and international significance and importance. And a lot of them are ground nesting. So a lot of people, when they think about protecting birds, they think about birds in trees. But these are ground nesting birds, shorebirds, seabirds, wading birds. Their nests are well camouflaged, so you might not even realise if you're out walking with your dog that there are nests nearby. And disturbance is a key issue for these birds. It's not just about attacks and injuries, although of course that's very important, but it's about disturbance. So if dogs are in these areas, then birds may fly off the nest, and then the eggs will go cold and won't be viable for that breeding season. So we are looking at putting in new protections in some of these areas of ecological significance. There are also, some of them have limited opportunities to feed. So you might be taking your dog for a walk on the mudflats. You're walking around the shore, the dog's on the mudflats, and there might be birds there that have been scared away, and you might think, well, that's okay because the dog's not barking at them or chasing them, but just that disturbance can mean that limits their feeding time. And if they're about to gear up for migration, or they've just returned from their international migration, then they really need that opportunity to feed. We've also had recognition since we did the last review on the Christchurch estuary as part of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Network. So that's an international network of spaces where those birds like godwits will travel from as far as Alaska right down to here in little old New Zealand. And it's one of 4 important wetland spaces in the country. So we're looking at increasing protections in the estuary. So these are our key proposals. So we're looking at requiring leashing on footpaths, shared paths, form tracks, and grey space areas, and joining that with a leashing requirement on footpaths and pedestrian areas on or near roads. So it's a requirement at the moment that you leash your dog on footpaths near roads, but it hasn't been clear whether that applies to parks as well. And also we've had this increase in shared paths where people are using paths for wheeled devices and other things. So we'd like consistency there. And also formed tracks. They're in all sorts of different types of parks that we have across the districts. So for example, in the Port Hills, there's a lot of formed tracks, and those Port Hills tracks have all been leashed since at least 2016, some of them in the policy before that in 2008. And a lot of those are also in regional parks where we're looking to protect wildlife too. So some of these changes, although they might look like changes, some of them are actually just getting consistency across the district on what's expected in those public areas. The Otakura Avon River Corridor, or former red zone, we're looking at putting restrictions in there. And also in the stormwater basins, which are quite similar if you look at them. So in general, we're trying to stop dogs from being in wet areas and planted areas. So a lot of the planted areas, we're trying to develop habitats. We're looking at ecological restoration, and similar with those wet areas and all of those birds that we mentioned before, leashing on paths and under effective control on mound grass. So we've got a lot of mound grass. For example, the Otakura Avon River Corridor is over 602 hectares. It's 3.5 times bigger than Hagley Park. And there's at least 200 years of mound grass in that area at the moment, and it is evolving and changing all the time. So we've tried to come up with something relatively flexible for that red zone because it's such a unique area, and there's so much planned in that area in the future in terms of restoration and wetlands and contouring the river and managing stormwater and flooding. The estuary, we're looking at prohibiting dogs in the estuary from the landward boundary inwards. So that would be around the margins. At the moment, we protect some areas of land around, but we haven't actually put a protection in on the estuary itself, and that's what we're looking at changing this time. We're also proposing a limit on the number of dogs that one person can be in control of in a public place at once. We've noticed an increase in people walking multiple dogs or pack walking dogs, and we want to make sure that anyone doing that in a public place where they'll come across other people and other dogs and other animals, that they are appropriately trained and experienced to do that, and that they've got good practices in place to manage any risks and public liability insurance and things like that in case the worst happens. So that's a new proposal that we've got in there. We're looking at improving the definition of under effective control a little bit. So remember that that's the default that applies in public places if there isn't a specific or a general requirement. So we're requiring people to take more active attention to their dog so that they know where their dog is and what it's doing, that their dog can promptly respond to recall, that they're close enough to recall and know what their dog is doing, and that their dog isn't creating a nuisance to any people or stock or other animals or other dogs. And we've also put a requirement in the bylaw that if you are unable to keep your dog under effective control, even if there are no rules, you should have your dog leashed in a public place to keep it safe and to keep other people and other animals safe. We've also got some new proposed leashed general areas, so these would apply in all situations. So leashing on all sports fields. Now that's only when games and practice sessions are on, and it's just in the practice area. So we've got some really big parks that have playing fields in them. You're fine if you're not near the game. It's just around protecting the game areas and particularly children. Leashing on wharves, jetties and boardwalks, that's consistency. A lot of those might be part of pathways and things. And again, it's a narrow space where accidents or injuries could happen. And looking at leashing in community gardens as well. And they all got quite good support when we were doing the survey earlier in the year. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just to let you know we've highlighted some of the bigger areas, but there are lots of other areas where we're looking at proposed changes. So in the peninsula, we've got a lot of mudflat areas and wildlife protection areas around the beaches. Port Hills reserves and walkways, as I said, a lot of those are already leashed, and we're clarifying a few of those areas. The northern Christchurch inland area, quite a few changes there. If you take your dog to the area, you might want to have a look. The coastal area, we've got Brooklands Lagoon, that red zone area there, and a few clarifications to the land around the Spit and the Styx River mouth and the conservation reserve there. East Christchurch is probably where the biggest changes are. So South Shore Spit is a change. The estuary, which we've mentioned, the Lower Avon Bexley Salt Marshes and Bridge Reserve, that's all land changes because of the earthquake. And those other ones there. There's some changes in the central city. So at the moment, the whole of the central city is leashed. We're looking at 3 areas lifting that leashing requirement so that dogs can be exercised under effective control and off leash on those grassed areas. So that's Latimer Square, Raota Park, and in the Avon Loop, which is just near Kilmore Fitzgerald. And then in the southwest Christchurch, those changes tend to be focused on drainage reserves and wetland areas. There's been a lot happening in that area lately. And we're on to questions.
Awesome, thanks heaps for that presentation, Tina. It looks like we've had a few questions starting to populate in the chat, but if you do have some questions, please pop them in that chat and we will get to as many as we can. The first question that we've had come in from Matthew, I think, is a 2-part question. The first part of the question is around what legal protecting wildlife policy that the council might be relying on in terms of bringing that forward in relevant dog control legislation. And then the second part of that question is whether council is looking at protection on birds from other animals like domestic cats.
I can jump in on the cat aspect there. So this project is about reviewing our existing dog control policy and bylaw, which the Dog Control Act requires us to have. So we're not looking at cats through this, we're looking only at dog control. So the Dog Control Act itself requires local councils to regulate dogs and to have a policy on dogs and the approach to dogs in the area, and it's partly because there's a health and safety aspect to that, so it's about reducing dog bites and injuries and things like that, and so we're looking at protecting wildlife as well. Whereas with cats, we don't have any national legislation to regulate cats. There's no Cat Control Act. With the Dog Control Act, we also have dog registrations, which are mandatory, and all of that dog registration pays for dog control activities that we undertake. So we don't have any equivalent funding mechanism for cats either. So at this stage, we're not looking at regulating cats. It was looked at with the Environment Select Committee recently, but in the end, they opted, or the current government, sorry, opted in response to the recommendations from the Environment Committee not to proceed with legislation to require councils to regulate cats.
Cool, thanks Tina. We've got another question here asking for some clarification on the East Red Zone. they are asking about the mown grass area. Does that mean all grassy areas?
Are you looking for clarification on long grass versus short grass? So I'll try and answer that. So because the Otakura Avon River corridor, so I guess the east area around the river there, which is the red zone, it's evolving all the time. So we're mowing large areas of it. There's over 200 hectares of mowing area at the moment, but there are some areas that have been left to have long grass, and that might be because either plantings have happened in those areas or because we're planning on planting in those areas. So the best way that we can communicate those evolving and changing areas is to have some areas with long grass and plantings, and that's where we don't want dogs to be. That's where we're looking at habitat restoration. And then the mown areas are where you can exercise your dog off leash and under effective control. There's no particular protections that we need in there other than interaction between people and dogs in those areas.
Thank you. So we've had another question about leashing requirements. So does it mean that dogs will need to be leashed throughout all wetland areas, including off the path?
So we have different requirements in different places. So all of that detail about specific named areas are all in the Schedule 1 and the policy at the end of the policy document. So that's what I had on that last slide with those titles. That's how that's structured with geographical areas. So there are many existing restrictions in wetland areas that we already have in place. So in some of those areas, dogs are prohibited completely. In some of those areas, dogs are prohibited in the wetland area, but they're allowed on paths if they're leashed. So you just need to check the particular area you want to go to and see which rules apply in those areas.
Awesome. I'm going to take the next question just to give Tina a little bit of a break. So we've been asked a question around whether there's a map to show the rules. So there is obviously a current map that shows the current dog control rules, and you can go and have a look at that if you Google where I can take my dog in Christchurch, that'll pop up. We don't have a map that shows the proposed changes. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different proposed changes in different types of areas, so it can be quite difficult to have a map that shows both new and proposed areas. You can look at all that information in Schedule 1 of the policy, and that map will be updated once those final changes are put through Council. So moving on to the next question, we've got a question around whether there's been any considerations made for providing more open spaces where dogs can exercise off-lead, such as dog parks, now that there's more regulation on dogs being leashed.
I think that's a really good question, and I think that also feeds into that clarification that any area that is not specified or covered by a general rule is an under effective control area. So in some council areas around the country, dogs have to be leashed in all public places and can only be exercised off leash in specified areas. That's not what we have here. Dogs can be exercised in all sorts of places, so we don't have a list of all those places because that would be enormous. We have quite relaxed dog rules in this district. We're quite dog friendly. I know it may not seem like it because we're looking at the restrictions, but in all those areas where we don't have restrictions, there's lots of neighbourhood parks, lots of sports parks, lots of the coastline. There's heaps. We've got over 10,000 hectares of parks in this district and a really long coastline, so we're incredibly lucky, and we only have restrictions in those places that are specified or covered by a general rule, and with good reason, and all those reasons are set out in the policy document.
Thanks, Tina. We've got another question around how the effectiveness of the new proposed bylaws are measured and reviewed over time. Do you want to have a chat about how all our bylaws are reviewed?
So we have 16 bylaws across council, and we're required to review them by the Local Government Act at least once every 10 years, or 5 years if it's a new bylaw. When we go through that process, we have to look at the bylaw making powers that we're using. We look at what's happening, the data and stats and information that we have. We talk to staff about what's happening on the ground, and then of course we might do a survey or something like we did with the dog control back in July, and then we propose changes with our best approach that we have and good practice, and then we consult with the community. So this is the phase we're at now where we're consulting and checking in with our community about how do you feel, is this too much, is this enough, have we covered this area, that sort of thing. So we're really interested in everyone's feedback.
Thanks, Tina. We've had another question around will bins be put into areas to reduce the amount of nuisance for people who don't pick up? Unfortunately, that's not something that's part of this project. So this project is to review the dog control bylaw and the rules set out for dogs. Where bins go is managed by our parks team, and obviously they can have a look at different areas. If there's a specific area that you're concerned about, you can send through a request to our customer service team, and they can have a look at that. Another question's come through, and this might be one for Lionel. Who will enforce the new laws? There's quite a number of dogs that are not registered and don't appear to be checked on. How can these laws be in place with confidence? Do you want to have a little bit of a chat around the enforcement activity that your team does?
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. We all have we've got a record of all the dogs in Christchurch. When we do come across dogs that are unregistered, we take a escalated compliance approach, giving a notification for dog owners to register their dogs. Like the majority of dog owners in Christchurch register their dogs on time, and then there's a small portion that we will follow up with where we do come across dogs that are unregistered and we're not getting response. We issue infringements. We issue a lot of infringements for unregistered dogs across the registration year, and we take a very proactive approach in ensuring that we get as many dogs registered each year, with the officers following up on as many as we can get to throughout the year.
Thanks, Lionel. We've got a question in around the definition of nuisance. Tina, is there a definition within the bylaw?
We mention nuisance in the definition of under effective control, and we talk about not creating a nuisance to any person, other dog, stock, or wildlife. Our interpretation of nuisance is running up to, rushing at, bothering, interfering with, chasing, that kind of thing is what we consider nuisance.
We've also had a question come through around the Association for Professional Dog Trainers New Zealand and Companion Animals New Zealand. We are in the phase of consultation at the moment, so the question is around why they haven't been consulted. So this is the opportunity for groups like that to feed into our dog control rules. And I would encourage them to get in touch with me directly if they have any concerns around the proposed changes. Just have another look through the questions that have come through. Cool. I see one of the questions a bit further up in the chat was asking about where someone can take their dog to swim. I think we had a question about that earlier on our Q&A on our webpage. So Tina, you might have some.
Sure, I can answer that one. We do. One of the dog parks we have has access to the water, which is at the groins. But again, any area that is not specified, you can take your dog, which includes accessing waterways. But we do suggest that dog owners are careful of waterways, particularly around toxic algae at the moment. There are some specific areas where we know toxic algae occurs, and in those areas we've prohibited dogs from waterways as well. So some of our protections are about wildlife, but some of them are also about protecting dogs. So just be mindful, particularly in the summer months, about toxic algae. I think there's been some dogs unfortunately keep becoming unwell in the area just to the north of the district as well. So if there's no specific limitation in the policy and bylaw, then you can take your dog there, but do be careful.
Thanks, Tana, and some really good advice there. We've had a question come through around control of number of dogs. So this person is talking about dog walkers and how they've seen some dog walkers with 8 to 12 dogs off leash. How can these laws help with that kind of situation?
Look, that's a great question. We're looking at putting in a limit on the maximum number of dogs that anybody can be in control of in a public space. So that's up to 4 dogs with 2 off leash at any one time. We've got so that restriction applies to everybody, whether you're a professional dog walker or not. And if you would like to be in control of more dogs, then you'll need to go through that application process to demonstrate that you're able to competently handle that many dogs, specify the number that you would like to be in control of. It can be really intimidating in a public place to come across a large number of dogs in an area. And if you've got multiple dog walkers as well, then that can be a problem. There have been some attacks and incidents where things have gone a bit wrong. So we're looking at changing things, and I think a lot of councils around the country are looking at this at the moment.
Cool. Another question in around the increase in number of dogs in the city. So there's 5,000 more dogs in the city. And the question is around what council is doing with the increased funding from registration. So what I will say is obviously with more dogs comes more enforcement activity, but I might just get Lionel to jump in and talk about the kinds of activity that their team would be using that funding for.
Yeah, got it now. Yeah, so we provide a significant amount of educational programs that we provide at free of charge to the community schools, businesses as well. It's not only towards children, it's also towards adults. We offer a free microchipping service. Every Wednesday, people can just bring their dogs down to the shelter and they get microchipped for free. Those activities come with a cost. We will attend approximately 10,000 call-outs per year across the city. And when we're talking across the city, that's from Templeton all the way down to Akaroa. So it's a significant area to cover, and it costs money to provide these services. And with the increased cost of everything, the cost of dog food's gone through the roof. We try to keep our dog registration fees as low as possible without impacting any service delivery. That is our primary concern, is to manage our budget, that service delivery is not impacted, and we continue to provide the services to the community.
Thank you, Lionel. A question around the Central City new rules. So why have Latimer Square and Roara Park been selected as potential off-leash areas in the Central City?
We looked at all of the green space areas in the Central City, so sort of between the 4 Avs and Hagley Park to the west, and looked at which areas would be appropriate to allow the increase in Central City residents and people bringing their dogs in the city to have their dogs off leash. And Roara Park and also Latimer Square were identified, and also the Avon Loop just next to Fitzgerald and the river in Kilmore, as good places where people would be able to exercise their dog, throw a ball, and enjoy themselves in that central city area. A lot of the other green space areas are very small. They're sort of pocket areas, or they are neighbourhood parks, which might be quite small other than a playground area, and they weren't seen as appropriate for dogs off leash. And of course, Hagley Park to the west is a great place to exercise dogs. We've had the rule there that dogs must be leashed on pathways when we did the last review, and any open area is a great space to exercise your dog off leash. And there's areas to the south as well, like Lancaster Park and things like that. So there's a lot of different opportunities for people in the central city, but we know that people were wanting more access, so that's what we've proposed in this as part of the review.
Perfect. A question has been asked about when these changes might come into effect. So we'll cover it off the timeline at the end of the presentation, but essentially we're in the consultation phase now, so people have their chance to have their say on the issues, and that is open until the 15th of December this year. Then following that, next year we'll have hearings, so that is where elected members will read all the submissions that come in, and they'll hear from people who would like to speak to their submission. They will then make a recommendation on the proposed changes to council, who will make the final decision. Once they've made that decision, we expect probably mid next year, and then the new bylaw and policy will come into effect, and that will be notified to dog owners. We've had another question come in, and we may not be able to answer this, but I'll ask it anyway, just in case Tina has a really good knowledge of of the area. Where can I exercise my dogs off leash between Barry's Bay and Akaroa?
That is a good question. I'm just trying to think about all of there aren't a lot of public spaces that aren't next to the road or coastal areas between Barry's Bay and Akaroa. So I know there are lots of areas in Akaroa where you can exercise your dogs, but I'm struggling to think of places along the state highway where dogs can be exercised under effective control. Or the grounds in Devotional, that would be a good place next to the camping ground. We are looking at putting more restrictions in those coastal areas, particularly the mudflat areas, which might not be great places for recreation anyway, but that's to protect wildlife in line with what we're proposing around the city. I can look into that further if you like and get back to you, but there are certainly lots of places you can take your dog for a walk on a leash. It's just unleashed areas might be a little bit harder to come by because of the geography, and there aren't that many public places between those bays.
Thanks, Tina. We've had a question come through in the Q&A around the Sticks Mill Conservation Reserve, and on our Where You Can Take Your Dog map, there is something saying that the location of the dog park is under review. Is that something we can elaborate on here?
No. The short answer is no. I'm not familiar with the dog park being under review in that area, but at the moment, the Sticks Mill area is a leashed area, but we're looking at changing it to prohibited because it's a conservation reserve, and we need to protect the wildlife in that area. The wildlife is increasing that area, which is great. We want to get more of it in there, and there are other places that are more appropriate to exercise dogs in the area nearby.
Thanks, Tina. A question around dog parks. So the question is, do we have a view on people bringing young children into dog parks? There's probably not much we can say in terms of a view on that, but can we please elaborate what the sort of rules are around dog parks?
I think that's a great question. So in dog parks, you have to have your dog under effective control. So that's, being aware, being near it, responding to recall, picking up after it, all of those sorts of things apply in dog parks. That's what applies there. You can't be in your car near the dog park. You have to be physically in the dog park, and you have to be taking good care of your dog. In terms of children, we caution people taking their children into dog parks. They are predominantly a space that is set aside for dogs to interact with other dogs, but it's anyone's judgment about what they do with their own children. But we do ask that people are careful and mindful of what that space is for, and just do what makes sense for them.
Perfect. What are the current rules around Sumner Beach? Apparently there's some signs that seem to have some conflicting information.
So that's a bit of a tricky area around Sumner Beach. So at the moment, the actual beach area is, so north of Cave Rock, is a summer beach prohibition area. So we have these in a lot of our coastal areas, and it tends to be a space that is near where the flags would be positioned for surf lifesaving clubs. So I think that the Sumner one is 50 metres from Cave Rock to the north, focused around there. The rest of the eastern coastal beaches are 100 metres either side of the surf lifesaving club, and that's just to have that space for recreation, so that children can access that space, so that people's belongings aren't getting interrupted by dogs. People can have picnics, those sorts of things, and they only apply during specified months, so the long summer months, and they only apply within certain hours. So I think from memory it's 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. And outside of those hours they revert back to under effective control areas. And you can pass through a summer beach prohibition area with your dog if it's on a short leash and you're passing through. So that means that on that eastern coastline, people can enter a summer beach prohibition area. They don't have to take their dog up and off the beach and along the road and then come back again. They can just walk through it as long as they're just quickly moving through it. There's a restriction also in Sumner around Cave Rock itself, and that's the actual rocky structure. We're going to redraw the map in that area so it doesn't cover the kind of sandy area around it. Scarborough Promenade has a leash requirement on it at the moment, and of course that would be covered by the new general restriction on pedestrian areas and leashing anyway. And then the park at Scarborough, that's also a prohibited area to dogs, and the paddling pool as well. And we're looking at putting a new restriction in I think it's called Sumner Regional Park, and it's the northern area by Shag Rock, and that's to protect wildlife in that area at the outfall of the estuary. So there's just a distance there from the corner down to the first beach access walkway where dogs are prohibited, and the rest of that area, where I know it's a very popular place for people to exercise dogs, that remains an under effective control area.
Awesome, thanks. We've got a question here, and it's around dogs meeting. So 2 dogs on a lead who are meeting on a path, and there's some detail in there about what the dog's behaviour is and those kind of things. But I guess the crux of the question is are the dog owners allowed to let them off on the grass that's beside the path to let them play and interact with each other as dogs would normally do when they're off lead?
Absolutely. So this is designed to be practical. This is not supposed to be heavy-handed. The proposal is that if you're walking your dog along a pathway, then you leash it. If the area near the pathway is an under effective control area, there's no other restrictions in place, then of course you can have your dog off leash and they can interact with other dogs. We've got a lot of areas where there's pathways, there's grass nearby. Carry on doing what you're doing on the grass. It's just in those congested areas and pathways where we've got different people walking, we've got different dog owners, we've got people on wheeled devices, all sorts of activities, then in those areas, then you need to leash your dog. If you're walking on the path and your dog's nearby on the grass area and under effective control, that's absolutely fine. It's just if you're walking with your dog on the path, then you leash it. Hope that helps.
Awesome, thank you. I just wanted to cover off that there are some questions in the chat that we haven't got to, and that may be because we just don't have the information to provide you live now. But any question that has been asked, we will endeavour to answer in writing. So we'll send out a Q&A document to all of you that have attended, and we'll pop it up on our webpage. I will just have another quick look through the chat, but if you've got some last questions, please pop them in. I noticed there's someone with their hand up. We have set this up so that you can't use your mics, but if you do have a question, please pop it into the chat. Cool. So we've got another question that's popped in around, is there any plans to expand the areas where dogs can be unleashed in the central city?
So at the moment, the whole central city is a leashed area, and we're proposing those 3 areas where we're looking at lifting that leashing requirement so that dogs can be exercised under effective control. It is possible in the future that we could look to develop a dog park area, but that's the same across the city. It's always a possibility, but it takes time to look at what's appropriate, the mix of spaces, the investment that's needed, the landscaping, the impacts on the nearby area. So they're all managed through parks process. So this particular review that we're doing here is about the level of regulation in those areas. So we're not looking at the moment at making any changes to the central city other than that lifting the leashing requirement in those 3 areas.
Perfect. Thanks, Tina. So another question that's come through is around whether it's possible to get a recording of this meeting. So you may have missed the intro at the start, but yes, this meeting is being recorded and it will be provided on our webpage. So we'll email all the attendees and let them know when that's available for them to view. So you can watch it back or share it with anyone who might have missed being here today. We had another question, and it's in relation to the dogs off lead around paths and being on the grassed area, and it's around whether we could make those changes to the policy. So, what I will say is that that sort of feedback is really helpful for us. We have had a little bit of feedback in that respect so far. So, if that's something you'd like to see in the policy, then please do put in submission to that effect. We can make different changes and recommendation based on feedback, and then that can be put into the policy. So we've had a couple of questions in that are around dog behaviourists. So I'll just get Tina to provide some information about that. So a lot of the questions are around who we've talked to in developing the bylaw and the policy, and the expert advice.
So my answer to that was covered in one of the earlier slides that we put in place. So the Dog Control Act itself requires us to manage some of those competing things. So we're looking at the recreational needs of dogs and their owners. That's one thing we've got to consider. We're also looking at how people feel in public spaces, that they're not feeling a sense of distress or intimidation from dogs, and that dogs are well controlled in those public places. So we look at a range of different factors. As I said earlier, our default is under effective control and off-leash in lots of areas. So there are a huge amount of opportunities across the district where people can exercise their dog, where they can respond to their natural tendencies, all of those sorts of things. But we do need dogs to be well controlled. We need to not have dogs fighting other dogs. We need to protect wildlife. We need to protect children, older people, all of the people in our communities that may not want dogs near them all the time. So it really is a balancing act, and dog owners themselves will make good choices about where they can take their dog, what's convenient to them, what opportunities are nearby. So we've got a whole range of different views that we're trying to respond to, and a lot of different understandings of how people feel about dogs, where people would like their dogs to go, and we're trying to balance all of that with what we're coming up with. And part of understanding that balance and whether we've got that balance right or not is this public consultation process. So if you have views in these areas, please do submit, include whatever information you can that's helpful to us, include specific information if you would like changes in a particular area, if you live in a neighbourhood or you travel to an area, that's all really helpful for us. Bigger, broader comments on how we should provide more areas, it's hard for us to respond to those. We already have a huge amount of space that is open to dogs with that default unleash and under effective control rule that applies. So specific information is helpful, but any views that you have on either what we're proposing to change or what the existing rules are really helpful, so do make a submission.
Thanks, Tina. We've had a question in around how a dog on a leash is a danger to wildlife. I know you covered this off earlier in your presentation, Tina, but they might have missed it. Would you mind covering off again how dogs can affect wildlife, even if they are in a lead?
Cool. I can pick up on that around areas like the estuary. So a lot of the birds that we have that are breeding and living in those areas are they're well camouflaged, and their nests are well camouflaged. So you might not realise that you're walking on or near or very close to nests, and that can be a problem for those birds. Its disturbance is an issue for those birds. This is internationally recognised. It's well understood. Certainly our partners in the Flyway Network internationally identified dog disturbance as one of the key risks to those particular types of birds and where they nest. So that is a real issue. So whether it's people walking or dogs on a leash, it can cause an issue. But dogs in particular can scare birds, and they pick up on scent trails. They're following all their natural inclinations, and that leads them toward places where birds are nesting or where chicks have hatched. So it's about making a shift in the right direction. A lot of people often, when they think about protecting birds, they think about tree nesting birds. These are ground nesting birds. It's quite a different situation, and they've got other risks and things that are going on around migration and flying and weights. So we're looking at moving things slightly in that direction so that we have better public understanding of what's happening in that area. The Estuary Trust in particular has been lobbying for a long time to have better protections of dogs around that estuary area. They've seen a lot of incidents of dogs barking and chasing at birds, of nests that have been destroyed, of chick remnants left behind. So we're doing what we can to nudge things in a direction that balances what people want to do with their dogs and gives them good access to nearby areas, but that puts those restrictions in place where it's necessary.
Awesome, thank you. This one will be a question for Lionel. What advice do you have if someone is out walking and they're being pestered by an overly enthusiastic or an out of control dog? At the time of the incident, there's unlikely to be a dog ranger on hand to assist. What could that person do if they needed help in that situation?
Thanks, Crystal. We have officers available 24/7. If any dog's rushing at a person in a public place, that's obviously a public safety risk, and the officers are required to attend to those as promptly as possible. What could the person do? Move away from the dog, try and create some distance between yourself and the dog, try not to startle the dog, and try and just keep something in your hands between you and that dog. It's disappointing that these instances do occur. That dog belongs to a dog owner, and the dog owners need to take control of their dogs, that they don't cause a nuisance in public places. And this is where the direction of the bylaw is going. There's a lot of places for the dog owners to have their dogs off leash, but if they do cause a nuisance, they need to take responsibility for that and put the dog on a leash.
Thanks, Lionel. All right, that basically brings us to the end of the session. Now, I know that there's a few questions in the chat that haven't been answered. Don't worry, we will get back to you. So we will answer questions in writing afterwards, and we'll provide those to you at some point next week. Olivia, if you can move us on to the next slide. So I briefly talked about the timeline before, just to reiterate that you can make submissions until the 15th of December. As Tina has outlined, your feedback is really crucially important, and you might have some information about particular areas. It's really important to provide as much information as you can in your submissions. That's really, really helpful for us. If you do feel really passionately about your submission, you are welcome to come and speak to the hearings panel. So the hearings panel are made up of elected members. They're, your councillors that you've elected. They'll hear from you in terms of your submission, and they'll receive staff advice before making a recommendation to council. As I said before, the council decision is likely to be at some point mid next year. So make sure you head along to our webpage to put in your submission. So that's letstalk.ccc.govt.nz. Like I said, any specific feedback that you have is very much welcome. We've now reached the end of our presentation, so thanks for everyone for joining us. If you have any feedback on the session or you have any more questions or comments, you can contact us about these. So if you've got another question you think of later, then you can email us through at letstalk at ccc.govt.nz, or you can give me a ring. My number is on the screen. Thanks again from myself and from all of the team. Enjoy the rest of your day. Tēnā koutou katoa.